Continuing our discussion of urbanization, I want to talk today about urban problems. One of the problems, from certainly an immigrant perspective, is the problem of exclusion. So many immigrants clinging to old ways scared native-born Americans. Their foreignness was blamed for all the problems of urban America. Their willingness to work for low wages angered native-born workers. There were political responses. In 1887, a guy named Henry Bowers forms the American Protective Association. It had 500,000 members by 1894. This is a nativist organization. Nativism is the policy of protecting the interest of native-born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants. It's a nice word for xenophobia, and you can see it at work today. Also in 1894, a more politically correct organization called the Immigration Restriction League was formed. It allowed educated, quote-unquote, proper middle-class people to be anti-immigrant. Congress excluded the Chinese before all this in 1882, although they only comprised 1.2% of the West Coast population. Congress passed literacy requirements for immigration in 1897. Had this been enacted, this would have stopped immigration because most of these immigrants couldn't pass a English literacy requirement, but President Cleveland vetoed it. Many people realized, and certainly Cleveland and his corporate sponsors, that immigrants were a cheap and plentiful labor supply for a growing economy. And this theme has always been true in America. Let's talk about some of the problems that arise from the urban landscape itself. Cities in the Gilded Age demonstrated both incredible grandeur and incredible squalor. By the way, this house on the left is the Carnegie Mansion. The problems of cities seemed unsolvable, but the technology and solutions that were employed spurred both technological and industrial developments. Urbanization and industrialization fed each other. Industrialization creates the urbanization, problems arise, but industrialization can solve them. For example, the Flatiron Building, the first real skyscraper in New York. Obviously, we're all crowded together, running out of space. One solution is to go up. But until there was steel, elevators, and electricity, such vast upward buildings would not have been possible. So industrialization spurs urbanization. Urbanization continues to enhance and spur additional industrialization. It's a positive loop. Housing was the biggest problem. It was not really an issue for the prosperous, for the prosperous, because cheap labor and new technologies and materials meant that people of even modest means could afford a house. The wealthy settled in the city center, but also increasingly with the middle class in new suburbs. Cheap land and light rail transportation made suburban settlement possible. Real estate developers sought to make suburbs reminiscent of the country, which urban residents miss. That's why we have these little fake pasture plots in front of houses. Suburbs look like the country because when they were invented in the Gilded Age, they were meant to remind you of the country. Most urban residents could not own in the city or move to the suburbs. With demand high and space scarce, landlords like to squeeze as many rent-paying customers as possible into a very little space. New York City in 1894 had a population density of 143 people per acre. That was higher than any in Europe at the time. It meant you could rent out something regardless of its condition. In New York City, more than 1 million people lived in tenements. Here we see an example of a tenement slum. The first ones in 1850 were built in New York, and they were hailed as great for the poor. Cheap housing, but they had no windows, little or no plumbing, or central heating. They had a row of privies in the basement. If you don't know what a privy is, ask me in class. New York state law of 1870 required windows, but then they just built air shafts, so you have like one little window looking out into a dark air shaft. These are not easy places to live. An immigrant himself, a Danish immigrant named Jacob Riis, became a journalist, and he published a book in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives. It was a photo essay of life in these tenements, in these poor neighborhoods. It was made possible for the first time because of the invention of flash photography. It kind of shocked the world just how poor and terrible these conditions were. Reese and other reformers felt that the slums should be razed, destroyed, though they offered no housing alternative. Transportation became a problem, a huge problem. Older streets, you have these people now, and they're moving around the city, and older streets were narrow, often unpaved. So when it didn't rain, you had lots of dust. When it rained, you had lots of mud. Chicago in 1890 had 2,000 miles of streets, only 600 of which were paved. Huge numbers of people had to move around every day, and this mandated the creation of mass transportation. Initially, it was just streetcars pulled by horses. Then in 1870, New York implemented the elevated railway, which Charlie talks about in 1876. It was noisy and filthy. The first electric streetcars arrived in 1888 in Richmond, of all places. So, first electric streetcars are in 1888. By 1895, 850 towns and cities had electric streetcars. The first subway was created in Boston in 1897. Road and bridge building technology boomed to create better transportation. The Brooklyn Bridge was built by a guy named John Roebling in the 1880s. It was, at the time, the largest steel cable suspension bridge in the world. Let's talk about some additional strains on urban life. Congestion, combined with the lack of public services, creates a severe strain, the best example of which may be fire. Fires destroyed many downtowns, which were mostly built of wood. Chicago and Boston both had quote-unquote great fires in 1871. This is a picture of the Great Fire of Chicago. They were terrible and deadly, but they spurred fire-resistant construction. They spurred the creation of public fire departments. That was an innovation of the Gilded Age. And frankly, there were great opportunities to implement architectural and technological innovations. Clear out all these old wooden buildings, we now can build these new skyscrapers. Disease was more deadly than fire. The poor had completely inadequate sanitation. Few officials saw the connection between sanitation, sewer and water systems, to epidemics like typhoid and cholera. Sewage flowed in open ditches and streams, contaminating water. By the way, this is a privy in the back courtyard of a tenement building. Numerous people, numerous families would share these. Poverty itself was perhaps the biggest strain. Many workers barely subsisted. We know that the average worker in the Gilded Age didn't make enough for a decent life. Private philanthropies helped some, but focused on the quote-unquote deserving poor. Protestant philanthropies, and most of them were, clashed with the Catholic poor over values and doctrine, things like drinking and various Christian beliefs. Poverty and density naturally bred another problem, crime. Middle-class native-born Americans ascribed the crime which was exploding in the Gilded Age. You've got all these people in these urban areas. They ascribed it to the natural proclivities of ethnic backgrounds of immigrants. Italians they're just criminals. Police forces grew for the first time in America, as they did in Europe, but often spawned corruption and brutality because they were filled by patronage, not by merit.